Welcome to the Positive Thought Podcast. My name is Nabil, and I'm a registered social worker. Happy to be joined by Samina, who's a child and youth worker. Samina, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, Nabil. Thanks for having me.
Our very first podcast. And while I wish it was under better circumstances, nevertheless, there's always something to be learned during moments of stress and hardship. I'm of course talking about COVID-19. And I wanted to approach it from a mental health and well-being perspective. Reflect on the impact that it's having on our psyche, our collective impact in society through social distancing, and the overall resilience to accept the realities of factors and variables that are just outside our control. Right now we are anxious and we don't know how to release that anxiety that we're holding on to into something that is beneficial or positive. But there is something to be said for anxiety that we're experiencing right now, isn't there? It isn't all bad. In fact, in moments such as this, anxiety is meant to kick in. It's meant to be experienced. Anxiety is part of that fight or flight response. It's the part of our drive for survival and self-preservation. Yet the challenge is in the way that anxiety manifests itself. Mm-hmm. We find ourselves overreacting in all sorts of unhelpful ways when we don't understand the anxiety that we experience. You can see that in the panic buying that sort of has taken place, in not adhering to social distancing and going to parks and all these events and things where people are congregating, right? What we don't realize is that is putting the most vulnerable at risk. When we're not adapting to situations in the best way possible. And I think it begins with understanding and recognizing our own anxieties, that it is present and it needs to be dealt with. Why do you think that is, Samina?
I think part of that could be because of how overwhelmed everyone is right now and the fear of what could happen in the worst case scenario. Like you just said, the way we respond could be challenging depending on how we're allowing our worries and anxious feelings to manifest within ourselves. Our extreme reactions and the instability we may be having. So not adapting to the situation in the best ways could very simply be because we see this situation as a threat to ourselves, and not just our health, but other important aspects of our lives that seem very uncertain at this point or very unstable. Speaking for myself personally, and perhaps others who are listening to this can relate, I do not do well with many transitions at the same time. I often get overwhelmed, and at times I can let the anxiety define me or control my behaviors or feelings or actions. But we are more than that. And if we give ourselves a chance to accept this anxiety as a normal part of life and to learn from it and help us grow and just become more resilient, this could have obviously some positive effects on our mental health. Sometimes just taking a deep breath works for me. It distracts me in the moment, and just focusing on that breath helps me become more aware and in control of myself, even if it lasts for a few seconds. Also, I just want to add that you mentioned putting the vulnerable at risk. This is because when we experience a threat, most times our immediate response is to save ourselves. And often we don't understand that the situation is not just affecting us, but it's affecting all of us. But as I mentioned earlier, we need to be empathetic and need to broaden our perspectives and look at not just ourselves or our parents and families, but also those who are experiencing challenges, but do not necessarily have a voice, and we are only hearing stories through media and news of those that make it on the news. So how well do we really see the effects of COVID-19? Many of those who are vulnerable, who may be in very difficult situations, we may not know the reality of those only because we're seeing and understanding the situation as we hear or read about it. So if we put ourselves in others' shoes, we can certainly become aware of other people's realities that may exist, even if we can imagine scenarios of what others may be experiencing and internalize those to react in certain ways in which our own fears can manifest more positively, and we can react in helpful ways instead of unhelpful ones moving forward.
You brought up two really interesting points there with regards to empathy, right? And this notion that when we feel threatened, how empathetic can we be to somebody if the will for self-preservation is greater than the collective good of society? And I think sometimes we mistaken the anxiety that we experience, that self-preservation strictly means looking out for myself. We know that if that is the mentality a person has, then you can't function living in a society, right? You live with people, you live with institutions, you live within communities and social groups, and as such, the collective good is always greater than the individual benefit. And I think that is what we're seeing now, right? We're social distancing, not because as an individual that is pleasurable or enjoyable, but as a community, we need to protect the vulnerable. We need to protect everybody, right? One of the things you mentioned was with empathy, right? I think it's critical in order for us to understand that our anxiety might sometimes manifest itself in things that are quite selfish sometimes, right? But really, one of the ways to combat that, just like you had mentioned, is to really wonder and empathize, not necessarily with the person's feelings, because you'll never be able to put yourself in their situation and know what they're going through, because that's their lived experience and you haven't had those experiences. But it's to understand, what does this situation mean to them, right? Think about a vulnerable elderly person, and when you empathize with what's happening with COVID-19 and you think about them, what does this mean to them? They might be limited in terms of their mobility, in terms of their access to resources. They might have underlying health conditions even before COVID-19. Now this angst that is being experienced by us, think about how they're experiencing it, and what does this mean to them, right? Will they look at this as a time in their life in which society stepped up and supported them, or will they, would this be something in which they felt completely isolated, even more so, and that sort of society let them down, right? So empathizing is critical, and I think the same goes with uncertainty. I think when we are not sure of what the future is going to hold, we tend to play out catastrophic thoughts and things that might necessarily lead to results that, at the moment feel is the worst case scenario, right? And we have to fight that. And sort of realize that anxiety has a place in society, and when you don't address anxiety in the best way possible, then those uncertainties, instead of becoming opportunities and instead of becoming hope, becomes dread and catastrophic, right? But it's up to you, and it's up to us as a society to recognize that we control our narrative, right? We control what the future is going to look like, and we control what we do now is going to determine how we come out of it. And if we do the things that needs to get done right now, if we look within, if we reflect, then we will be a better society for it.
So you make a very good point, Nabil, and I just wanted to say that if we are strong and we act in positive ways right now, once we have to go and transition back into our normal life, and hopefully that's soon, it's just going to become a little bit easier to transition, rather than like having to struggle now and then that making it harder for us to get back into our daily routines. So what we do now will determine how we will act once we're out again working or going back to school or any of that.
I couldn't have put it better myself. Samina, thank you for this. I think this was good in terms of just talking about things. I think even for us, just talking about what COVID-19 sort of means to us, and how we see ourselves, being who we are right now, and sort of testing our patience and challenging ourselves now for the betterment of society that includes us, in the hopes of a better tomorrow. And we need to hope for a better tomorrow in order for us to do our best today. So that was the Positive Thought Podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, I'm Nabil.
I'm Samina.
Take care.